Hey, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into an incredible and honestly pretty overlooked story that's buried deep in the origins of Islam. It's a story about a forgotten kingdom, ancient storytellers, and a cultural connection you probably never saw coming. So, our journey starts with a puzzle, one that's had scholars scratching their heads for centuries. You see, when you really start digging into early Islamic literature, especially the stories that flesh out the Quran, you start to hear some, well, very familiar echoes. And that entire puzzle really just boils down to this one question. Why do so many of the stories about figures, like Moses or Solomon or Adam and Eve, stories told by the very first Muslims, contain all these little details that you won't find in the Quran, but you will find in ancient Jewish texts, like the Midrash? I mean, where did that come from? Well, there's actually a word for these crossover stories. Isrāʻīliyyāt. It literally translates to Israeli traditions. For the longest time, figuring out how they got there was a real mystery. And to solve it, we've got to completely rethink the world that Islam was born into. You know that picture you might have in your head of pre-Islamic Arabia, just an isolated, empty desert? Well, turns out the historical reality was the complete opposite. It wasn't a vacuum at all. It was a buzzing, crowded crossroads of massive civilizations. Let's just redraw the map in our minds for a second. Up to the northwest, you've got the Christian Byzantine Empire. Over to the northeast, the mighty Sasanian Persians. And then, just across the Red Sea, you have the Christian Kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia. So, far from being isolated, Arabia was literally squeezed between these superpowers. It was a place of nonstop trade, conflict, and, of course, a huge exchange of ideas. And this quote just nails it. Trying to understand early Islam without all of this rich, complicated context, it's like trying to read a book without any of the footnotes. You're just missing half the story. So where are we going with this? In our hunt for the source of these Israelite traditions, the biggest clue, it turns out, isn't up north with the big empires. No, it's way down south, in the highlands of what we now call Yemen. So down in Yemen, we find this place, the Himyarite kingdom. For centuries, they were a major power, controlling the super valuable incense trade. But what's really wild is their religious journey. Over a few hundred years, the people in charge shifted away from their old pagan gods and started embracing monotheism. And by the 5th century, that monotheism had become, pretty explicitly, Jewish. Just look at this shift. They went from worshiping gods like Al-Makah, the moon god, to worshiping one single creator they called the Merciful One. And inscriptions show they were invoking the God of Israel and even observing the Sabbath. And get this wasn't just some small group. This was the state religion of a powerful Arabian kingdom. This all comes to a head, a really dramatic and violent head under their last king, a guy known as Dunawas. He was a very zealous convert, and he began targeting the Christian communities in his kingdom, which led to a famous and brutal massacre at the city of Najran. And that act of violence is what would trigger an international crisis and bring the whole kingdom down. So, in 525 CE, the Christian Aksumite Empire across the sea in Ethiopia invades and conquers Himyar, putting an end to its Jewish rule. But the story doesn't end there. Oh no, not by a long shot. In fact, things were about to get even more complicated. What you end up with is this incredible cultural layer cake. Right at the bottom, you have the original Himyarite culture, with all of its unique Jewish influences. Then, on top of that, you get a new layer of Ethiopian Christian rule. And then, right before the rise of Islam, the Sasanian Persians sweep in and add a third layer. Can you imagine? What an unbelievably rich and diverse place this must have been. Okay, so this unique history made Yemen the perfect melting pot for stories and ideas. But how did this heritage, this specific blend of Southern Arabian and Jewish traditions, actually get into the mainstream of Islamic thought? Well, it wasn't magic. It was carried by people. Okay, get ready for this number. I mean, really, 5,000. Over 5,000. That's how many prophetic traditions, or Hadith, are traced back to a single man. A man with deep roots in Southern Arabia named Abu Huraira. Abu Huraira was from a tribe right on the border of Yemen, and he was famous for just being a sponge for knowledge. We're told he actively went looking for teachers who knew all about the old Jewish traditions. So is it any surprise that when you analyze the thousands of stories he told, a huge chunk of them have exactly this kind of Isrāījliyyāt material? But if Abu Huraira was the main channel, our next guy was the source itself, I want you to meet Ka'b al-Akhbar, maybe the single most important person for understanding how all this Jewish lore entered early Islam. I mean, just look at his resume. He was a Yemeni Jew. He came directly from that Himyarite culture we've been talking about. His title, al-Akhbar, is basically the Arabic way of saying the rabbi or the scholar. After he converted to Islam, he moved to Medina, and the caliphs, the early leaders of Islam, thought his knowledge of biblical history was so valuable that they consulted him all the time. So let's put all the pieces together. Here's how the chain worked. You start with these living, breathing oral traditions down in Yemen, the legacy of that Jewish kingdom. Then you get people like Ka'b, the expert, and storytellers like Abu Huraira, the amplifier, who carry these stories with them. And finally, their accounts get written down and woven right into the fabric of Islamic tradition. So what's the big takeaway here? What does this all mean? Well, understanding this history doesn't make the past simpler. It makes it way richer, way more complex, and a lot more interesting. It forces us to throw out the clean, simple version of history we might have learned. For a long, long time, some Islamic scholars were really suspicious of these Isrāʻīliyyāt stories. They saw them as a kind of foreign pollution, something that corrupted the pure tradition. But the more modern, historical way of looking at it is totally different. These stories aren't a corruption at all. They're proof of a deep, living, cultural conversation that was happening back then. And look, this isn't some gotcha moment. This history doesn't make Islam inauthentic or anything like that. In fact, you could argue it does the opposite. It shows us that this faith didn't just appear out of nowhere, in a vacuum. It grew up in a world that was absolutely saturated with amazing religious stories and ideas, and it naturally entered into a dialogue with them, absorbing and rethinking a shared heritage that was centuries old. And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. When we uncover these deep, tangled roots, these stories that just hop over all the boundaries we've built between our faiths and our cultures, how does that change the way we see our own histories and maybe even each other today? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me.